Good evening or afternoon or morning, whenever you might be looking at this. This is our fourth virtual assignment. I'm going to have this posted on Wednesday evening during normal class hours. Just a couple of things that I want to remind you about. The fourth and final written assignment is due next Wednesday, the 15th of April. The 15th will also be our final class, and you will receive a take-home final on the 22nd. We're going to talk about Hollywood and crime and punishment today. There's a PowerPoint that's also going to be posted on Moodle, in which you can follow along with this lecture, and it's important that you do it because you'll be able to click on the links in order to see the clips that we'll be going over during this lecture. Some of you I've sent emails to. You haven't completed one of or more of the assignments, and it's important that you get in there and you complete those. They are going to have an impact on your grade. You have a new syllabus which I posted several weeks ago, so you can look at that to see what you might have missed. Okay, so much of what we know about the criminal justice system, lay persons and people who are non practitioners in the field is what we see in the movies, and we've learned a lot from movies, whether that's good or bad. For instance, the Miranda warnings. Just about everybody can recite the Miranda warnings because we've heard them so often, either in movies or on television. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can be used against you. If you can't afford an attorney will be appointed for you. We know that things like the CI factor, which is based on the multitude of television programs that sprung out of the forensic science based programming, and which has really changed the way that people look at real criminal justice situations, particularly jurors who expect that there's DNA or fingerprints or all different types of physical evidence available instantaneously, and that's much of that has been shaped by what people see in movies and on television. Now we're going to cover a number of movies and their depiction of the criminal justice system from various different perspectives. The first movie is a movie from 1954, The Caine Mutiny, which starred Humphrey Bogart and Fred MacMurray, Jose Ferrer, and Van Johnson. Now, other than Humphrey Bogart, you may not have heard of any of these other actors. Maybe you never heard of Humphrey Bogart, but these were all top-rated actors, and this was a movie that started as a novel. As you'll see, some of the other movies that we're going to talk about too, it was first a novel, and this is a military trial in which there was a mutiny on board a ship that was right after World War II. That was the captain of the ship was Humphrey Bogart, who the crew thought had some mental health problems, and there was a trial then based on the mutiny, and it's a very interesting perspective on the art of cross-examination, letting a witness kind of hang himself by just rambling on, some of the things that a lawyer never wants his client to do. You have to know when to stop when you're have a witness on the witness stand. So if you click onto the link for the Caine Mutiny, you'll see an effective cross-examination of Humphrey Bogart, the captain of the ship. The next movie is Anatomy of a Murder, which was a movie from 1959 that starred Jimmy Stewart, Lee Remick, Ben Gazzara, and George C. Scott. This movie is an interesting movie that takes us through contrasting styles in a courtroom. If you click on the link for Anatomy of a Murder, you'll see an examination and various objections by counsel that gives you, some glimpse into what a courtroom is really like. The interesting thing about Anatomy of a Murder is the judge in that case was actually a lawyer in real life, not an actor. His name is Joseph Welsh. And Joseph Welsh became famous for during the McCarthy hearings, where he took a very principled stand and sort of attacked the committee. If you know anything about the McCarthy era hearings, it's when they were trying to weed out communism first in Hollywood, and then with law firms and government agencies and things like that. So if you click on the link under Joseph Welsh's name, you'll see his famous sort of admonishment to the Senate with regard to a young witness who was called before the Senate. When you watch Anatomy of a Murder, it's going to remind you of things that we've talked about in the course, such as Brady versus Anderson, turning over exculpatory evidence to the defense, evidence that might be, considered helpful to the defense. You also see, the idea of counsel being an advocate for his client. The third movie is To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a classic, which again is a classic, which was a classic book in which Harper Lee won the Pulitzer Prize. This movie came out in 1962. Gregory Peck was the star. He played the role of Atticus Finch. He won an Academy Award for that portrayal. So it's a classic book. It's a classic movie, and you will when you click on the clip from To Kill a Mockingbird, you'll see again courtroom examination, I believe argument by Gregory Peck, and you'll see how he handles the issues in a Southern courtroom in his closing argument, of injustice and race, and attacks the victim, which is something that has become very much the issue in a lot of trials in the modern era. But this was 1962, or before that, when Harper Lee wrote about the issue. So it really is an interesting perspective. The next movie is Judgment at Nuremberg, which was a movie that came out in 1961, in which it starred Spencer Tracy, Burt Lancaster, also Maximilian Snell, who won the Academy Award for his portrayal. And when you watch this clip, I believe it is of Maximilian Schell, who was a defense attorney during the trial, who is cross-examining a witness. What this phase of the Nuremberg trial was about, that's depicted in this movie, was the point where the Americans, the Allies, the Americans, the Russians, the English, the French, were prosecuting judges for war crimes because they were enforcing the racist law of the Nazis. They were now being tried to determine whether or not they had some responsibility to refuse to enforce those laws. And it's a very effective cross-examination by the defense attorney Maximilian Schell, who brings up an American court opinion when talking about the judges in Nazi Germany enforcing sterilization orders. So women who had mental health problems or were intellectually disabled or had some other disability were often sterilized in Germany so they could not reproduce. Unfortunately, in the United States, that very thing happened in the early 20th century, and through a process known as eugenics. And the United States Supreme Court made a decision in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes made a very, in retrospect, caustic, divisive kind of statement where he said that 3 generations of imbeciles was enough when he upheld an order sterilizing a mentally retarded woman. So we also will have an opportunity to take a look at 12 Angry Men. If you remember, we looked at this movie in another aspect of the course when we were talking about witnesses and wrongful convictions, and the idea that eyewitness testimony sometimes is not what we think it is, and we at times put too much emphasis on those witnesses. But in this portion of the 12 Angry Men, if you remember, Henry Fonda was taking a position as the lone person who was voting for not guilty, and eventually persuades, with the help of other jurors, all 12 to find the defendant not guilty. But in this one, it's a very vivid depiction of prejudice. Okay, Ed Begley, whose son later became an actor, probably before your time as well, but he gives kind of a stirring racist speech, and you see how the jurors deal with that racist speech, and it's still I think an important depiction as to how we should deal with racists today. Also, the 6th film that you're going to have an opportunity to see some clips from is And Justice for All. This is a 1979 movie. It starred Al Pacino and Jack Warden, and Al Pacino is defending a judge who's accused of sexual assault, and he takes the rather unusual position during his opening argument that in fact his client is guilty, and it's a famous clip from a movie depicting the criminal justice system How realistic it is another thing, but it certainly is entertaining. It also, this clip will also introduce you to things like the opening statement, although it's certainly uncharacteristic of one, a mistrial. What's the difference between truth and justice? Polygraph, which is normally not admissible or ever spoken about in a trial. So it may be a bit far-fetched, but it's entertaining. And speaking of entertaining, the seventh movie that you'll be able to see a clip from is My Cousin Vinny. Now, My Cousin Vinny starred Mira Sorvino, Joe Pesci, Fred Gwynne, who, if you ever watched an old black and white rerun of The Munsters, you would know that Fred Gwynne was Herman Munster. But essentially, two New York City kids get arrested in Alabama for robbery and murder. They don't have anybody to represent them, so the one kid has a cousin who's an attorney, Vinny, up in Brooklyn. He calls him, he comes down to Alabama. This is the second movie of the two that's from Alabama. To Kill a Mockingbird took place in Alabama, and My Cousin Vinny took place in Alabama. So if you click on the link to My Cousin Vinny, you'll see some very impressive expert witness testimony that comes from Vinny's girlfriend or wife, that really shows you a difference in the culture between a lawyer and expert from Brooklyn and a judge and prosecutor from Alabama. It's a woman versus man issue. It's really a matter of language. What dialect do people speak in Brooklyn and speak in Alabama, and how those two clash? It's a comedy. Joe Pesci is great as usual in this movie, but it also has some real underpinnings of the criminal justice system, and is worth watching, and hopefully you'll find the clip interesting. The eighth movie is a foreign film from Australia, Breaker Morant, and that movie was released in 1980, and this is also a military court-martial. And the background of the case is Breaker Morant is the name of a person. He was an officer in the Australian Army, and the British and the Australians were fighting the Boers, who were Dutch, in Australia, and in Africa. And what was happening is, it was really the first war in which guerrilla warfare was used. So the Boers, the Dutch, were not wearing uniforms. They weren't fighting a conventional battle. They were hiding in the mountains and coming down and attacking the British. And the other thing that they would do is after they would kill the British, or the Australians, they would take their uniforms, because they needed coats and uniforms, because they didn't have any supplies. So there was sort of an unwritten rule while this war was going on, that if you caught a Boer with Australian khaki or British khaki, their uniforms, that you would shoot them on the spot. So Breaker Morant and two other officers, their battalion was ambushed. They then went out looking for the Boers. They found them. They were wearing their comrades' uniforms, so they shot and killed them. At the same time, the British were looking for a way to get out of the war. It was kind of like Britain's Vietnam. And so they wanted to make a gesture to the Dutch, to the Boers, that they were interested in trying to resolve this. So they said that they decided they were going to court-martial Breaker Morant and the other officers for summarily killing these Boer soldiers. So they were being made scapegoats, and there was a book written about this. It was called The Scapegoat for the Empire, and that's what this movie was based on. And so you're going to see a portion of the trial, and then ultimately their execution, which I think we may have seen earlier in the course as well. But it's still interesting, and the issue here is really about justice, and is it the greater good? Is justice preserving the greater good? So the British wanted out of this war, and it could save a lot of British soldiers and Australian soldiers' lives. But in order to do that, they had to make this gesture by sacrificing these 3 soldiers. So is justice meted out if you save thousands of lives by essentially sacrificing 3 lives? The 9th movie is Witness for the Prosecution, which was a 1957 movie. It starred Charles Laughton, who was a British barrister who was representing a woman accused of murder, who was really taking the rap for her boyfriend. And it's a very interesting movie, very interesting set of facts, and how this whole process, this whole scheme kind of was put together and then unraveled. But what's interesting, there's a couple of clips of Charles Laughton. You see how he sets up the witness during cross-examination. So it's a very poignant look at how criminals scheme, but also how a defense attorney unwittingly doing his job and doing it effectively helps these individuals carry out their scheme, but ultimately it unravels. It unravels in the end. But it's a very good look at cross-examination. The final movie is Animal House, which was released in 1978. John Belushi, Tim Matheson, Donald Sutherland, a lot of interesting characters in a very interesting movie. And so you probably wonder, how does Delta House and all the beer drinking and partying going on there have any insight into the justice system? And so if you look at the clip for Animal House, you'll see an interesting administrative hearing. They want to expel the Delta fraternity and its members from Faber College. You might be wondering why I know so much about this. I was in high school in 1978. Animal House was probably, I hate to say, the movie of my generation. But this administrative hearing, it shows a very interesting and commonly used tactic, where the fraternity just sort of diverts attention from the real issue, and drapes themselves in the flag, and talks about due process, and you obviously uses humor, but essentially says, hey, we're not going to participate in this un-American tribunal, this un-American persecution of this fraternity. And basically, after making a rousing speech, the members get up and walk out of the administrative hearing. It's a tactic that we see commonly used in politics, but used with a tinge of humor here but really getting across the same point. So you'll be able to look at the clips of these movies. They're listed on the final page of the PowerPoint, as well as throughout the PowerPoint, and you'll be able to then retrieve the assignment and answer the questions. The unusual thing obviously is class. You have Easter break, so I'm going to ask that you complete this assignment by no later than Friday at noon, because the college is asking that your results be turned in by Friday at noon. So please provide your written response through Moodle or through an email to me by Friday at noon. Thank you, and have a happy holiday weekend, and keep social distancing and stay in the house as often as you can.